Here is something worth sitting with before the story begins. The man who found Troy also destroyed it. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but with the particular thoroughness of someone who was so certain of what he was looking for that he couldn't slow down long enough to look carefully. Heinrich Schliemann spent the better part of his adult life and a considerable fortune proving that the city described in Homer's Iliad was a real place that had existed in the real world, and he succeeded. And in succeeding, he drove his excavation trenches straight through the most significant layers of the site, tearing apart the evidence that would have told us what he most wanted to know. The story of how this happened and why, and what it means for the long question of where myth ends and history begins, is the story we are going to settle into tonight. Before we go any further, if stories like this are the kind of thing you come here for, subscribing to the channel means the next one will find you when it is ready, without you having to go looking for it. There is genuinely no better company at this particular hour than history told slowly and in the dark. Now, let us begin. It is late afternoon on the plain of northwestern Turkey, and the light is doing what light does in that part of the world at that hour, turning the limestone hills the color of old bone and laying long shadows across the flat ground where the land runs down toward the sea. The mound sits in the middle distance, low and unremarkable from here. The kind of rise in the earth that a traveler passing through might take for a natural feature of the landscape and think nothing more of it. The wind comes in off the Aegean, carrying the smell of salt and dry grass, and the plain is quiet in the way that places are quiet when they have been the same for a very long time. There is almost nothing to look at from here. That is the point. The plain extends in every direction, flat and sun-dried, interrupted only by the occasional stand of scrub oak and the low lines of stone walls that mark the edges of fields that have been fields for as long as anyone in the region can remember. The sea is visible to the west, a thin strip of blue-grey beyond the last low hills, and to the northeast the Strait of the Dardanelles catches what is left of the afternoon light, carrying it in long rippled bands across the water. Everything is exactly as horizontal as everything else, and the mound, rising perhaps 30 meters above the plain at its highest point, is the only vertical thing for a considerable distance in any direction. In the evening light, it looks like nothing in particular. It looks like a hill. It does not look like the place where, depending on who you ask and how literally you are prepared to read a very old poem, one of the most consequential events in the history of Western civilization may or may not have taken place. It does not look like anywhere that a person would spend 11 years of their life and a very substantial personal fortune digging toward. And yet, for one man in particular, this unremarkable mound of compacted earth and ancient rubble on the edge of an agricultural plain in what was then the Ottoman Empire was the one piece of ground that had occupied his thoughts, off and on, for the better part of 40 years. The question he was trying to answer had been waiting for a long time. It had been waiting, in one form or another, since the ancient world itself decided that the stories were too old and too strange to verify, and simply accepted them as a kind of cultural inheritance, part of the weather of being Greek, present and unquestioned, the way the sea is present and unquestioned. Where does myth end and history begin? At what point does the story a civilization tells about its own past become something a person with a spade could go and look for? That question is still not fully answered. But it was a German businessman with a childhood obsession and a gift for self-invention who forced the modern world to take it seriously. The physical landscape that contained this question is worth sitting with for a moment longer before the history begins. The region the ancient Greeks called the Troad occupies the northwestern tip of the Anatolian Peninsula, the finger of land that points toward Europe across the narrow strait. It is a landscape of low, rounded hills and river valleys, and the alluvial plain of the Scamander, a river that appears repeatedly in the Iliad under that name and still flows under a different Turkish name, through the same ground it flowed through 3,000 years ago. The hills behind the plain are dry and pale, covered in the low shrubby vegetation of the eastern Mediterranean, and in summer they hold the heat, the way stone holds heat, radiating it slowly back into the air through the long afternoons. The sea is always somewhere nearby. In the Iliad, the Greeks camp on its shore, and the sound of the waves at night is a constant presence in the poem, the background noise of the entire war. This is the world the poems described, not a world of abstractions or allegory, but a world of specific geography, specific weather, specific distances between one place and another, specific details about the way the light falls and the way the wind moves and the smell of the salt on the air. Homer, or whoever Homer was, knew this landscape, or knew someone who knew it, or drew on a tradition that had been preserving the knowledge of it for centuries. The poems are full of the kind of specific local knowledge that does not come from imagination. They name the rivers. They name the hills. They describe the view from the walls. By the time of the 19th century, the poems had been in continuous circulation in the Western world for roughly 2,500 years, which is itself an almost incomprehensible span of cultural continuity. They had been copied by scribes in Alexandria and Constantinople and the monasteries of medieval Europe, translated into Latin and Italian and French and English, read by schoolchildren and soldiers and kings, quoted at weddings and funerals, and in the letters of people who wanted to say something about the nature of fate and the cost of beauty and the particular sadness of watching something irreplaceable burn. The Iliad and the Odyssey were, in the precise sense of the word, foundational, the foundation on which a very large proportion of what the Western world understood itself to be had been built. The question of whether any of it had actually happened was therefore not a casual scholarly question. It was the kind of question that had consequences for how people understood the relationship between the stories they told and the world those stories described. And by the middle of the 19th century, the scholarly consensus had moved, with considerable confidence, to the conclusion that the answer was no. The Trojan War, most educated people believed, was a myth, a magnificent myth, a myth of enormous cultural power and literary beauty, but a myth nonetheless, which is to say a story that had never corresponded to any particular sequence of actual events in any particular place. The city of Troy, if it had ever existed at all, was not a place anyone could find or excavate or stand in. It was an idea. It was the kind of place that only exists inside a poem. Heinrich Schliemann did not agree. He had not agreed since he was a child, and he was constitutionally incapable of updating his opinion in the direction the evidence was supposed to push it. This, as it turned out, was both the thing that made him right and the thing that made him dangerous. And the story of the excavation at Hisarlik is inseparable from the story of that particular combination of qualities in a single person. The boy who would become Schliemann was born in 1822 in a small town in the German Duchy of Mecklenburg, the son of a Protestant pastor whose income was modest and whose household was not a comfortable or particularly stable one. His mother died when he was 9. His father, Ernst Schliemann, was a man of considerable energy and modest means, who seems to have given his children a great deal of stimulation and not very much security, and who read aloud to them in the evenings from whatever books he had to hand, including, on one occasion, that his son would remember for the rest of his life, a history of the ancient world that contained an engraving of the sea, City of Troy in flames. The young Heinrich looked at that engraving and asked his father whether anyone knew where that city was. His father told him that no one did, that the city was lost and might never be found. The boy, according to his own account of the moment, told his father that he would find it himself when he grew up. This is almost certainly a story Schliemann constructed retrospectively, shaped in the telling to give his life the shape of a destiny rather than a series of accidents and decisions. He was a gifted self-mythologizer, which is to say he was a man who understood that the story of his own life was a resource as valuable as any other resource he possessed, and who managed it accordingly. But the childhood obsession with Homer was real, even if the precise moment of its origin was polished in the retelling. The poems were genuinely central to his interior life in a way that went beyond intellectual interest. He believed in them the way other people believed in scripture, not as literature, but as testimony, as the record of something that had actually happened to actual people in an actual place that still existed somewhere on the surface of the earth. The scholarly debate that Schliemann was positioning himself to enter had a long and complicated history of its own. For centuries, ancient writers had treated the Trojan War as a real event that had taken place at a specific historical moment and had located Troy in the northwestern corner of Anatolia with considerable consistency. Thucydides, the most rigorously empirical of the ancient historians, accepted the war as historical fact while being skeptical of the more extravagant details. Strabo, the Greek geographer who lived in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century of the Common Era, identified the mound at Hisarlik as the probable site of ancient Troy and wrote about it as such. For much of the ancient world, the question of whether Troy had existed was not even a question worth asking. Of course it had existed. Homer said so, and Homer was the closest thing the Greek world had to a sacred text. The problem was that the ancient world itself had ended, and its knowledge of its own geography had not survived intact. The Byzantine period, the medieval period, the long centuries during which classical learning was preserved in fragments and copies and second-hand accounts had obscured many things that the ancient world had considered obvious. By the early 19th century, the location of Troy was genuinely uncertain, with several different sites in the region of the Troad having been proposed and argued over by scholars who disagreed about which ancient descriptions should be trusted and how literally they should be read. Frank Calvert, an English diplomat and antiquarian who owned part of the land at Hisarlik, had been arguing since the 1860s that the mound was the most plausible candidate. It was Calvert who would eventually point Schliemann toward the site, and Schliemann who would receive most of the credit for what followed. By the time he was a teenager, he was already learning languages with a facility that bordered on the uncanny, a gift he would use throughout his life to insert himself into new commercial territories and new social worlds. He learned Dutch and English and French and Spanish and Portuguese, picking up each new language in a matter of months, through a method of his own devising that involved reading aloud constantly, writing long passages from memory, correcting himself against the text and finding native speakers to talk to at every opportunity. Ancient Greek came later and was, by his own account, the one language he learned not for commercial advantage but for the pure need to read Homer in the original, to hear the words as they had first been composed rather than filtered through a translator's choices. The commercial career that preceded the excavation was remarkable in its own right. Schliemann made his first fortune in the indigo trade in Amsterdam and St. Petersburg, his second in California during the gold rush, not by mining, but by buying and selling gold dust and running a banking operation for the miners who needed to convert their finds into money. He made a third fortune during the Crimean War, supplying materials to armies that needed them urgently and were not in a position to negotiate hard over price. By the time he was in his early 40s, he was extraordinarily wealthy, and he had arrived at a point that very few people ever reach, the point where money has ceased to be a problem and the only question remaining is what the money is for. He already knew the answer. He had always known the answer. The excavation at Troy was not a late-life enthusiasm or a retirement project. It was the thing he had been accumulating the resources to do since he was a child, looking at an engraving of a burning city and asking where it was. The only remaining questions were logistical: where exactly to dig, and how to obtain the permissions necessary to dig there, and what to do about the fact that he was, by training and credential, not an archaeologist at all, but a businessman who had taught himself Homer. These were not small questions, but they were, for a man of Schliemann's resources and determination, questions that were capable of being solved. The boy was 7, perhaps 8, and he was sitting at the table in the parsonage at Ankerschegen, a small town in the province of Mecklenburg in northern Germany, watching his father trace the outline of a burning city in an illustration in a history book. The book was Geray's Illustrated History of the World, a popular work of the period aimed at educated families, and the engraving it contained showed the walls of Troy in flames, with the figures of fleeing Trojans visible in the foreground, tiny against the scale of the catastrophe behind them. The boy looked at the image for a long time and then asked whether anyone knew where that city was. His father told him that Troy had been destroyed completely, that nothing remained. The boy found this impossible to accept. If those walls had been as large as the picture showed, he said, they could not simply have disappeared. They must still be there, somewhere, under the ground waiting. That boy was Heinrich Schliemann, and the argument he made at the table in Ankerschegen in the late 1820s was the argument he would spend the next 50 years of his life trying to prove. What makes this more than a convenient origin myth, the kind that successful people retrospectively attach to their childhoods, is that it isn't actually a myth. Schliemann wrote about this moment repeatedly in his diaries and memoirs, with a consistency of detail that suggests either genuine memory or a story so thoroughly rehearsed it had become indistinguishable from one. His father, Ernst Schliemann, was a pastor with scholarly interests and an appetite for history, and the family home contained books that would have been unusual in a provincial German parsonage, including Homer in translation. The engraving was real. The conversation, or something very like it, appears to have been real. The obsession it seeded was certainly real, and it shaped everything that followed. Ernst Schliemann was not, by most accounts, a particularly admirable man. He was charismatic and intellectually lively, and he drank too much and had a weakness for women that eventually destroyed his marriage and his position in the parish. When Heinrich was 9 years old, his mother died, and not long afterward, his father sent him to live with relatives in a neighboring town, partly for economic reasons and partly because the household had become unmanageable. The years of a normal German bourgeois childhood that might have been expected to follow did not materialize. Heinrich was educated at various institutions, showing a gift for languages and a capacity for concentrated effort that his teachers noted without quite knowing what to make of, and at the age of 14, he was apprenticed to a grocer in the town of Fürstenberg, which was the practical end of any formal education he might otherwise have received. He spent 5.5 years behind the counter of the grocery, working 14-hour days for minimal pay, doing the work of a trade that held no interest for him while sustaining himself, as far as anyone could observe, almost entirely on the internal resources of a remarkably self-contained mind. The obsession with Troy was not something he spoke about openly in the grocery, or if he did, no one recorded it. What he spoke about and what he was already doing systematically in whatever time was not consumed by the shop was the study of languages. He had a gift for them that went beyond ordinary aptitude, a capacity to absorb grammatical structures and vocabulary with a speed that he himself described as something close to a physical sensation, the feeling of a new system of meaning clicking into place. By the time he left the grocery in 1841, he could read and write in several languages and had begun what would become a lifelong practice of teaching himself new ones through the method of reading aloud, repeating and writing out passages from texts until the language became automatic. The method deserves a moment of attention because it is central to understanding Schliemann as a person, and it is central to understanding how he approached excavation 30 years later. His language learning technique was immersive to the point of saturation. He would select a text in the target language, often a novel or a history, and read it aloud for 2 or 3 hours without stopping, making no attempt to translate or analyze as he went, simply letting the sounds and rhythms accumulate. Then he would write out passages from memory, then compare the written version to the original, then return to reading aloud. Within a few weeks of beginning this process with a new language, he could sustain a simple conversation. Within a few months, he could conduct business. The method was not subtle, and it wasn't scholarly, but it worked, and the man it produced was someone who experienced language not as a system of rules to be learned, but as an atmosphere to be absorbed, a total environment that he could enter and inhabit and eventually move through without thinking. This quality of total immersion, of throwing himself at a thing until the thing became part of him, was the most consistent characteristic of his entire life. Let the grocery years settle for a moment, because they matter more than they appear to. 5.5 years behind a counter in a small German town with no formal education and no obvious prospects might have been the end of any ambition larger than regional commerce. For Schliemann, they appear to have functioned as a kind of enforced incubation, a period during which he could do very little about his circumstances, but could do a great deal about his preparation for whatever circumstances might eventually open up. He was not passive in his unhappiness. He was patient in it, and patience of that quality, sustained over years and directed toward a specific end, produces something that isn't quite the same as the ordinary kind. It produces, specifically, a person who is very difficult to stop once the circumstances finally change, because by the time the opening arrives, the preparation has been going on for so long and so quietly that the capacity for action is already fully formed, waiting only for the occasion that will allow it to be used. He left the grocery because of a hernia sustained while lifting a barrel, a small accident that closed one path and opened another. He made his way to Hamburg, where he found work as a ship's cabin boy on a vessel bound for Venezuela, and the ship sank in a storm off the coast of the Netherlands, and he washed ashore near the town of Texel with nothing except what he was wearing. He was 21 years old. He had just survived a shipwreck, and within a few weeks he had found work as an office boy for a trading house in Amsterdam, presenting himself with such confidence and evident capability that the firm hired him despite his having essentially nothing to recommend him except the conviction that he should be hired. The Amsterdam years were the foundation of everything. Schliemann worked for the trading house of B.H. Schroeder and Company with the same concentrated intensity he had applied to the grocery, but now in an environment where concentrated intensity was rewarded rather than wasted. He applied himself to languages with a method he had been developing since adolescence. Take a text, read it aloud for several hours a day, translate and retranslate, write out passages from memory, then move to the next text. By the time he had been at the firm for 2 years, he had added English, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese to the German he had arrived with, and was beginning to look at Russian, which had a particular practical relevance for the Baltic trade that the firm was expanding into. Russian was where the money was, and Schliemann found Russian with the same speed he found everything else. Within a year of beginning the language, he was corresponding in it. Within 2, he was sent to St. Petersburg as the firm's representative, and what he found there was a market of extraordinary and largely untapped commercial potential for a man who spoke Russian fluently at a time when almost no Western European traders did. He negotiated with Russian merchants on their own terms, in their own language, with a grasp of their commercial culture that came from the same quality of total immersion he applied to everything. He grew wealthy with a speed that he himself seemed to find slightly surprising, as if the fortune were arriving faster than the plan to acquire it. He became in his 30s one of the more prosperous independent merchants in St. Petersburg, trading in indigo and saltpeter and a variety of other commodities that the Crimean War and its aftermath made suddenly and enormously valuable. He expanded his operations, established connections in multiple European cities, learned to read the movements of markets with the same pattern recognition skill he applied to languages, and continued, throughout all of this, to add languages to his list. Ancient Greek was always on the horizon. He had learned enough of it in his teens to read Homer with assistance. Now he wanted to read it without assistance, and he applied to Homer in the original the same method he had applied to Russian and English and the rest, reading aloud, translating, writing out, until the ancient language was as present to him as any other he knew. What was happening during those St. Petersburg years, beneath the commercial activity and the language study, was a gradual reorientation of purpose. Schliemann was not a man who found commerce satisfying in itself. He found it useful, a means to an end that he had identified as a child, and never entirely lost sight of. The money was accumulating faster than he needed it to accumulate, and the question of what to do with the surplus was not, for Schliemann, a question about comfort or status or the pleasures that wealth typically purchased. It was a question about when, exactly, it would be enough. He had begun to give himself a number, a figure at which he would consider himself sufficiently secured against the future to allow himself to stop earning and start spending, and that spending would not be on property, or travel, or the social entertainments of St. Petersburg's wealthy foreign community. It would be on Troy. The first marriage belongs to this period, and it wasn't, by the standards of happiness, a success. Ekaterina Listchin was a Russian woman from a merchant family, and she married Schliemann in 1852 with what appear to have been realistic rather than romantic expectations, which is to say she married him because he was wealthy and because the alternatives were worse. He was absent frequently, he was consumed by his commercial interests and his private studies, and he appears to have been constitutionally incapable of the kind of domestic attention that a marriage requires from both participants. They had 3 children and an increasingly distant relationship, and when Schliemann decided, in the early 1860s, to liquidate most of his business interests and redirect his life entirely toward archaeology, Ekaterina refused to follow him into what she regarded as an eccentric and financially irresponsible enterprise. The marriage continued in form for some years while ceasing in substance, and Schliemann eventually obtained an American divorce of questionable legal standing in Russia that would cause him complications for the rest of his life. By the mid-1860s, he had indeed liquidated. The fortune that remained after the process was substantial, more than enough to fund years of independent scholarly work, and Schliemann spent the late 1860s doing what he hadn't had the leisure to do before: reading archaeology seriously, visiting the sites of the ancient world as a traveler with scholarly intentions, and positioning himself within the emerging discipline of classical archaeology as someone whose wealth and enthusiasm might make him a useful patron even if his credentials did not yet qualify him as a practitioner. He visited Greece, Egypt, the Levant. He attended lectures at the Sorbonne. He enrolled briefly at the University of Rostock, which awarded him a doctorate in 1869 for a thesis written in ancient Greek, a credential that was more symbolic than substantive, but that he valued with the particular intensity of someone for whom formal academic recognition had always been inaccessible. The second marriage was arranged with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else. He wrote to the Archbishop of Athens, a man he had met through his scholarly connections, asking him to recommend a young Greek woman of good family and classical education, who might be willing to marry a wealthy German widower with archaeological ambitions. The Archbishop recommended Sophia Ingastromenos, who was 17 years old, classically educated, and from a respectable Athenian family of limited means. Schliemann met her, assessed her Greek as excellent, approved of her intelligence and her appearance, and proposed marriage with a directness that Sophia's family found unusual, and Sophia herself appears to have found somewhere between alarming and intriguing. She was 40 years younger than he was. She married him in 1869 and would, within a few years, become the person most associated in the public imagination with the discovery that made his name. What Schliemann needed from a wife at this point in his life was not companionship in the domestic sense, but a collaborator in a project that required someone who could work alongside him in the field and who understood the Greek world, its language and its landscape and its local customs, with a native's intimacy rather than a scholar's distance. Sophia provided this, and she provided more than he had perhaps anticipated when he made his efficient enquiry to the Archbishop. She was genuinely intelligent, genuinely interested in the work, and possessed of a physical stamina that excavation required and that a woman raised in 19th century Athenian domestic comfort might not have been expected to have. She learned the work alongside him, became his most trusted field assistant, and maintained, across 40 years of an unusual partnership, a loyalty to Schliemann's project that survived the strains that his personality and his methods invariably produced. Whether she was happy in this arrangement is a question the historical record answers obliquely and inconclusively, which is perhaps the most that can be said. The move to Athens also completed a shift in identity that Schliemann had been working toward for years. He was no longer a merchant who studied languages and harbored archaeological ambitions. He was an amateur archaeologist, self-funded and self-directed, with a Greek wife, a house in Athens, a substantial library of classical texts, and a specific site in mind. He had read the scholarship on the location of Troy, had followed the debate about whether the site was at Bunabashi, the candidate that the majority of scholars favored, or at Hisarlik, the mound that a British consul named Frank Calvert had been quietly arguing for since the late 1860s. Schliemann visited both sites. He walked the ground at Bunabashi and found the distances wrong, the geography inconsistent with what Homer described. The Homeric text was precise about certain physical details: the springs near the city, the distances that characters covered in the course of the action, the relationship of the walls to the sea, and Bunabashi satisfied almost none of them in a way that Schliemann found convincing. He stood on the mound at Hisarlik, which Calvert had partially excavated on the land he owned at the site's southern edge, and found that the distances worked, that the geography corresponded, that the mound sat at the right distance from the shore and at the right angle to the prevailing winds. He felt, or later claimed he felt, that the ground was right. What he also felt, though he was careful about how much he said this aloud to people whose opinion he was still trying to win, was that the ground was his. By the time Schliemann was in his mid-40s, he had made 2 fortunes, taught himself more than a dozen languages, circled the globe, gone through a first marriage and a carefully arranged second one, and positioned himself in Athens with enough money and free time to do the thing he had been waiting to do since he was a child. The only question remaining was where, exactly, to dig, and that is where we leave him, this improbable figure with his self-taught Greek, and his borrowed conviction and his very considerable bank account, standing at the edge of a decision that his contemporaries considered eccentric and that history would judge rather differently. We can move forward now to the spring of 1870, and to the moment when Schliemann first stood on the mound at Hisarlik and understood, in the way that obsessive people understand things, that this was the place. What happened next would take 3 years, a great deal of money, a considerable amount of luck, and a method that future generations would spend a long time trying to forgive. Schliemann stood at the edge of the mound at Hisarlik for the first time in the early spring of 1870, looking at what appeared to be an entirely ordinary piece of Turkish farmland, a low swelling in the flat plain that a traveler in a hurry might not register as anything at all, and understanding, or believing he understood, that what lay beneath it was the answer to a question that had been open for 2,500 years. The mound was perhaps 30 meters high at its highest point, and roughly 200 meters across at its broadest, and it was covered in scrubby vegetation and the remains of a Greek and Roman settlement that anyone with formal archaeological training would have spent considerable time examining before touching. Schliemann did not spend considerable time examining it. He looked at it, walked around its perimeter, made several entries in his journal about the relationship of the site to the coastline and the hills behind it, and began planning where to start digging. The question of permission took longer than the question of location. The Ottoman government controlled archaeological access to sites within its territory, and Schliemann's initial attempts to secure a firman, the official document authorizing excavation, were unsuccessful for a period that he found deeply frustrating and that his surviving correspondence describes with the barely suppressed impatience of a man who has waited 40 years for something and finds himself now blocked by bureaucracy. He began a small, unauthorized dig in 1870 on the portion of the mound that lay within Frank Calvert's privately owned land, reasoning that private property required no government permission, and this initial probe confirmed what he had suspected. There were substantial ancient remains beneath the surface, much older than the Greek and Roman layers visible at the top. He covered the excavation and waited. The firman arrived in 1871, and Schliemann began digging in earnest that same autumn. The logistics of the operation Schliemann mounted in 1871 and the seasons that followed were considerable, and they are worth understanding because they help explain both what was accomplished and what was lost. He had to hire and house a large workforce in a landscape with no nearby infrastructure suited to the purpose. He built wooden barracks for the workers near the mound, established a supply chain for food and equipment from the nearest substantial town, arranged for the presence of an Ottoman government representative who was required to be on site at all times to ensure compliance with the excavation terms, and organized the removal of the enormous quantities of spoil that the trenches would produce. All of this he managed himself, with Sophia's assistance during the periods she was present at the site, and with the help of a small number of trusted foremen who directed the daily work on the ground. He was simultaneously excavating a major archaeological site, writing detailed journal accounts of what was found each day, conducting correspondence with scholars and publishers across Europe, and preparing the preliminary publications that would begin to make his work known to a wider audience. Frank Calvert deserves more than a passing mention here, because his role in the story of Hisarlik is one of those historical injustices that becomes more visible the more carefully you look at it. Calvert was the British consul at the Dardanelles, a man of considerable private scholarly accomplishment, who had been studying the archaeology of the Troad for years, and who had identified Hisarlik as the probable site of Troy before Schliemann arrived on the scene. He had published his argument in an archaeological journal in 1863, 8 years before Schliemann's first major excavation season. He owned the southern half of the mound and had conducted small-scale test excavations that confirmed the presence of deep prehistoric layers. When Schliemann came to him in 1868 seeking information and advice, Calvert shared it generously, introduced him to the site, and helped him understand the significance of what was there. Schliemann absorbed all of this, acknowledged Calvert's priority in his early correspondence, and then, as his own excavations produced results that captured the world's attention, gradually reduced Calvert's name in his public accounts of the discovery to a footnote. The excavation that began in autumn of 1871 was not, by any subsequent standard, a careful one. Schliemann arrived with a workforce that at its peak numbered more than 100 laborers, recruited locally from the surrounding villages, and he directed them with the energy and the urgency of someone who was not interested in the archaeology of the upper layers, because he was certain the thing he was looking for was at the bottom. He wanted the Bronze Age city, the Homeric city, the city of Priam and Hector and the burning walls in his father's history book, and everything above it was, in his view, debris to be moved. He drove trenches through the mound from north to south, cutting through the accumulated centuries with a directness that shocked the small number of formally trained archaeologists who visited the site during those years and watched what he was doing. The stratigraphic method, the practice of excavating layer by layer and recording the relationship of each find to the layers around it, had been developed and was beginning to be understood in British archaeology by the 1860s, though it wasn't yet uniformly applied even in Europe and was essentially unknown in the practice of classical archaeology in the Eastern Mediterranean. Schliemann was not trained in it and did not apply it. He was trained in commerce and in languages and in the management of large enterprises, and he applied all three to Hisarlik with considerable efficiency. What he removed from the mound in those first seasons was staggering in quantity. Walls, pottery, tools, animal bones, carbonized grain, architectural fragments of many periods, all mixed together in the spoil heaps that grew up around the excavation. Some of it was catalogued, some of it was photographed, much of it was simply moved to make room for the next trench. The records of what was found and where, the documentation that would have allowed later scholars to reconstruct the sequence of occupation at the site, were partial at best and absent at worst. There is a particular quality of loss involved in what happened at Hisarlik in those early seasons that is worth sitting with, because it isn't the ordinary kind of loss, the kind that comes from neglect or ignorance. Schliemann was not ignorant of the fact that the upper layers contained evidence of human occupation. He saw them. He documented some of what he found in them, photographed walls and artifacts, noted the changes in pottery style and construction technique as the trenches went deeper. The loss was not the result of carelessness, but of priority. He had decided before he started digging what he was looking for, and everything that was not that thing was in the way. The Greek settlement at the top of the mound, which postdates the Bronze Age by roughly 1,000 years, and which a classical archaeologist would have found enormously interesting, was to Schliemann essentially fill to be removed. The Iron Age remains below it. The layers that represented the centuries between the Bronze Age collapse and the Greek reoccupation of the site were similarly moved through and discarded. And in moving through them, he destroyed their internal structure, their relationship to each other, their capacity to tell the story of what happened at Hisarlik. Across those intervening centuries, they were the context for his Troy, and he shoveled them onto the plain. What he was finding as the trenches went deeper was extraordinary, regardless of the methodological problems. The mound at Hisarlik was not a single archaeological site in the sense of one city buried beneath its own rubble. It was a sequence of cities, each one built on the leveled remains of its predecessor, stretching back across thousands of years of continuous human occupation. As the trenches cut through the layers, Schliemann's workers were passing through Greek and Roman remains at the top, through a Hellenistic settlement below that, through what would eventually be identified as at least 9 distinct Bronze Age and earlier occupation levels, each one representing a city that had been built, occupied, destroyed or abandoned, and then built over again. Schliemann could see the layers and the walls of his trenches, could observe the changes in pottery and construction technique as the excavation went deeper. But he didn't stop to record them systematically, because stopping was not his method. He was going down. The physical evidence that did survive Schliemann's excavation method was, even in its decontextualized state, remarkable. His workers found walls of large cut stone at multiple levels, the kind of defensive construction that implied substantial organized communities with the resources to quarrel with their geography and win. They found ceramic sequences that stretched from coarse handmade Bronze Age wares through the wheel-thrown pottery of the later periods. The stylistic changes telling a story of changing populations and cultural connections that Schliemann noted without fully understanding. They found evidence of destruction and rebuilding at multiple levels, burned timbers and collapsed mud brick, and the kind of disordered debris that follows a catastrophic event. At one level, the one Schliemann had designated as the second city from the bottom, the burned layer was particularly pronounced, a thick stratum of ash and heat-cracked material that extended across a wide area of the excavation, and that was associated with the remains of substantial buildings and, crucially, with objects that were clearly not ordinary domestic goods. He was getting closer, or he believed he was getting closer, and this belief was doing everything that his kind of certainty always did. It was making him move faster. Rest with that image for a moment. 100 men with pickaxes and shovels, cutting vertically through 4,000 years of accumulated human life, carrying the debris up and out in baskets, dumping it on the plain below, while a driven man in a suit and a wide-brimmed hat stood at the edge of the trench and looked down into the deepening cut and calculated how much further there was to go. The plain was hot in summer and cold in winter, and the work was unrelenting, and Schliemann was there for all of it, watching, directing, measuring, writing in his journal every evening with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the record he was keeping was the only record that would survive. The journals from the Hisarlik seasons are remarkable documents, not for their archaeological precision, which is variable, but for the quality of attention they reveal. Schliemann noticed everything. The texture of the soil as the trenches went deeper. The way the light fell across the cut faces of the mound in the late afternoon. The names of individual workers who showed particular skill or reliability. The color and hardness of the pottery fragments that came up in the baskets. He was not a trained observer in the disciplinary sense, but he was a deeply habitual one, and the habit of attending closely to the details of a situation, of writing everything down and returning to what he had written, was one he had developed in his years as a merchant and never lost. The journals do not give us the stratigraphic record that would have allowed later archaeologists to reconstruct the sequence of occupation at the site. They give us, instead, the experience of being there, which is a different and in some ways more irreplaceable thing. There is a sentence in the journal from the summer of 1872 in which Schliemann describes the view from the mound at the end of a working day, the plain below in shadow, the Dardanelles visible in the distance catching the last of the light, the workers moving back toward their barracks in small groups, and he writes that it is difficult, standing in this place at this hour, not to feel that one eye is standing on the edge of something enormous. He was right about that. He was standing on the edge of something enormous. He was just wrong about the shape of it. The 1871 season ended with the trenches down several meters into the mound, and the upper layers thoroughly disturbed, and Schliemann returned to Athens and began the work of preparing his first major publication. The book he produced, published in 1874 under the title Trojan Antiquities, was a substantial volume illustrated with photographs and drawings of the objects and architectural remains he had found, and it introduced the wider European reading public to the excavation at Hisarlik for the first time. Its reception was mixed in the way that things are mixed when they are too large and too strange to be easily categorized. The classicists were skeptical, the archaeologists were troubled by the methods, and the general reading public, which had no strong investment in either camp's professional anxieties, found the whole enterprise genuinely thrilling. Here was a man who had believed in Homer's Troy when no one else did, who had gone and dug a hole in Turkey and who appeared to have found something. Whether it was the right something remained to be determined. By the end of the 1872 season, Schliemann had identified what he believed was the Homeric city. Deep in the mound, at a level he designated Troy II, he had found the remains of a substantial settlement with massive defensive walls, internal architecture of some scale, and, crucially, a burn layer, a stratum of reddish soil full of charcoal and ash and heat-cracked stone that indicated the settlement had ended in fire. This was the city he had been looking for. The burned city. He was certain of it, with the certainty of a man who has been certain since he was 7 years old, and finds that the evidence, at last, is confirming what he knew all along. He announced the identification in his correspondence and in the preliminary publications he was already preparing. And he returned for another season in 1873 with the intention of completing the excavation of his Troy and finding whatever it had left behind. He was aware, as he departed Athens, that the scholarly community remained unconvinced, that the objections had not been answered to everyone's satisfaction, and that the case for Troy II as the Homeric city was still, in the eyes of those best placed to judge, provisional rather than proven. That season would deliver something neither he nor anyone else had anticipated, something that would pull the story of Hisarlik out of the specialist journals and into the newspapers of every major European city, making a name that no one outside classical archaeology had previously known into one that almost everyone, by the end of that year, would recognize. the scholarly community's response to Schliemann's preliminary announcements was not, in the main, enthusiastic. The established classicists of the period had spent their careers working with texts, with the close reading of Homer and Thucydides and the other ancient sources, and they had generally concluded that the Trojan War was either a mythological construct or, at most, a legendary elaboration of something so distant and distorted that no physical evidence of it could possibly survive in recoverable form. A wealthy businessman announcing that he had located Troy in a Turkish mound on the basis of a theory he had held since childhood, and proposing to prove it by digging, struck many of them as somewhere between eccentric and faintly absurd. The letters that passed between the major classical scholars of the period during Schliemann's early excavation years contain a quality of politely suppressed skepticism that occasionally breaks through into something less polite. Who was this man exactly? And on what basis did he propose to adjudicate a question that professional scholars had been debating for 2,000 years? The question had some justice to it. Schliemann's qualifications were genuine but unconventional. He could read Homer in the original Greek with a fluency that few classicists could match, but he had no training in archaeological method, no institutional affiliation, no peer-reviewed publications, and an approach to the site that the more methodologically minded observers found somewhere between dismaying and catastrophic. He was also, which the scholarly community found both irritating and undeniable, finding things. The walls were real. The burned layer was real. Whatever was down there at the bottom of his trenches was genuinely ancient, genuinely significant, and genuinely beyond what anyone had previously excavated in that region of the world. The question of whether it was Troy was a separate matter from the question of whether it was important, and on the second question, even the skeptics were beginning to concede that Schliemann's improbable venture had produced something that deserved serious attention. What Schliemann's trenches produced was evidence of extraordinary antiquity and complexity. Walls, streets, burned layers, artifacts, and what they destroyed, layer by layer as they went deeper, was the stratigraphic record that would have allowed future archaeologists to make sense of what they were seeing. He was finding things and losing things simultaneously, and he had no idea he was doing the second. And that's where we leave the trenches of the 1872 season, deep in the mound, the burned layer exposed and identified, the scholarly world still largely skeptical, and Schliemann already in motion toward the next season, with the gathered certainty of a man who has been right once and expects to be right again. We can move forward now to the spring of 1873, to the last weeks of excavation before the season's close, to a morning when Schliemann sent his workers on a break and picked up a penknife. What he did next with that penknife, what occupy the newspapers of Europe for the remainder of the year and the historians of archaeology for the century that followed. Schliemann, in May of 1873, noticed a gleam of gold in the face of a trench wall at what he had identified as the burned stratum of his Troy, and he told his workers to take a break, and he began to dig the material out himself with a penknife, piece by piece. In the early morning light, the wall of the trench was dry, and the light was coming in low from the east, and what Schliemann could see in the exposed face of the cut was not one object, but many. A concentration of metalwork in gold and silver and copper that was quite unlike anything the excavation had produced before. He called Sophia over. She came, and together, in the time that the workers were resting, they excavated the cache from the trench wall and carried it up to the surface, wrapped in Sophia's shawl. What they had found, counted and catalogued in the days that followed, was unlike anything the modern world had seen come out of an ancient site. Gold diadems, silver vessels, a hoard of objects that had no precedent in the archaeological record of the region. There were more than 8,000 individual objects in the deposit. gold diadems of considerable sophistication, cup-shaped earrings, necklaces of gold and silver, bracelets, rings, a pair of gold sauceboats of a form that Schliemann associated with the Homeric word for a specific type of drinking vessel, copper lance tips, silver ingots, and various other objects in metal and stone whose function was not immediately obvious. The largest of the gold diadems was a cascade of fine chains attached to a headband, designed to be worn hanging down over the face and temples in a style unlike anything known from the classical Greek world. Something older and stranger than anything the scholarly imagination of 1873 had prepared itself to encounter. The deposit had been placed in what appeared to be a copper vessel of some kind, and the whole assemblage had been covered, or perhaps simply buried when the building around it collapsed in the fire and had lain there undisturbed. For however many thousands of years separated the burning of that city from the morning Schliemann's penknife found it. Schliemann named it immediately. He did not wait for analysis, did not wait for scholarly opinion, did not hedge or qualify or express the kind of cautious uncertainty that the circumstances might have warranted. He called it Priam's treasure, the hoard of the last king of Troy, hidden at the moment of the city's destruction and never recovered by those who had hidden it. He was, in that moment, not an archaeologist assessing a find. He was the boy from Ankershagen, finally holding the proof of what he had always known. The practical decisions he made in the days that followed the discovery reveal something important about Schliemann that his public presentation of himself tended to obscure. He was not, beneath the romantic self-mythologizing, naive about the world or about the consequences of what he had found. He was a businessman, a man who had spent decades navigating complex negotiations in multiple languages across multiple legal systems, and he understood immediately that the Ottoman authorities, who had the legal right under the terms of his farman to a share of any significant fines, would claim the treasure if they knew about it. He concealed the find from the government representative who was supposed to be present at the excavation, smuggled the objects out of Turkey in multiple shipments, and delivered them to Sophia's family in Athens, where they were stored until he could arrange for their examination and eventual transfer to Europe. The smuggling was not, in Schliemann's view, a moral problem. The Ottoman government had, in his assessment, no genuine claim to objects that had belonged to the Greek world of the Bronze Age, and the bureaucratic requirements of the firman were an inconvenience to be managed rather than an obligation to be honored. He was wrong about this in both the legal and the ethical sense, and the consequences came swiftly. The Ottoman government sued him in the Greek courts, won a judgment against him, and obtained an award of damages. Schliemann paid the fine, supplemented it with a substantial additional donation to the Ottoman Museum in Constantinople, and used the resulting goodwill to negotiate new excavation rights at Hisarlik for future seasons. He treated the entire episode as a commercial negotiation that had gone somewhat against him in the first round, but that could be recovered in subsequent dealings, which was, in a sense, precisely what it was. The photographs were the transformation. Before the photographs, the discovery of Priam's treasure was a story in the scholarly press, interesting to specialists and to the educated public that followed classical archaeology, but not yet a sensation in the broader sense. After the photographs, it was something else entirely. Schliemann had Sophia pose wearing the largest of the gold diadems, the headband with its cascading chains, and the earrings and necklace from the deposit, and he arranged for the resulting images to be distributed to newspapers and illustrated magazines across Europe. Sophia was young and striking, and she wore the ancient gold with a composure that the camera found compelling, and the image of her thus adorned which Schliemann released with the caption identifying the diadems as the jewels of Helen, the ornaments of the Trojan queen whose abduction had started the war, spread across the European press with a speed that only the most resonant images achieve. It is worth understanding what the photographs were doing at a level beneath the simple communication of an archaeological discovery. Schliemann was not naive about the power of images, and the decision to photograph Sophia wearing the objects, rather than simply laying them out on a surface for documentation, was a deliberate one, a choice that transformed the treasure from an archaeological find into a story about people, about the living connection between the ancient world and the present, about a modern woman dressed in the ornaments of a woman who had lived 3,000 years before her. Whether Sophia was Helen, or whether the diadems belonged to Helen, were questions that the image held in productive suspension, neither asserting nor denying, simply presenting the comparison and leaving the viewer to complete it. Schliemann understood, in a way that the scholarly community of his period generally did not, that what makes the ancient world matter to people who are not already invested in it isn't the accuracy of the claims made about it, but the vividness of the connection it offers. The photographs were vivid. They worked. The publication of the treasure, in the comprehensive form that Schliemann prepared for his major work on the excavation, produced a response that moved in two directions simultaneously. Among the general reading public in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, the response was one of uncomplicated fascination. The story of the treasure, the secret excavation, the shawl, the photographs, the smuggling, the lawsuit, and the subsequent settlement had all the elements of a romantic narrative that required no specialist knowledge to appreciate, and it was told and retold in newspapers and popular magazines and drawing room conversations throughout the year following the announcement. Schliemann was a celebrity of a kind that 19th century scholarship had not previously produced, a figure whose name was known to people who had never read a classical text and had no intention of reading one. He had found Troy. That was the story. Everything else was detail. Rest here for a moment with what those photographs accomplished, because it is worth understanding what they did to the story. Before them, the Trojan War was a scholarly subject, a matter for classicists and philologists and the educated public that read their work. After them, it was a news story, a human story, a story about a man who had believed something the experts said was impossible and had gone and proved it, and about a woman wearing 3,000-year-old gold in a photograph in your morning paper. The distance between the Bronze Age and 1873 collapsed in those images in a way that no academic paper had managed or attempted, and the collapse was not entirely honest, but it was not entirely dishonest either. The gold was real. The woman was real. The city had been real. Schliemann had found it. The scholarly community's response to the treasure was more complicated than the newspaper coverage suggested. The leading classicists of the period examined the preliminary reports and the photographs with an attention that was, if not warm, at least serious. And what several of them noticed in the course of that examination was a problem that Schliemann had not mentioned in his announcements. The pottery associated with the treasure deposit, the ceramic material found in the same layer as the gold, was of a type that was increasingly being understood, through comparative analysis with material from other sites, to be considerably older than the period traditionally associated with the Trojan War. The pottery was handmade rather than wheel-thrown, coarse rather than fine, of a kind associated with the early Bronze Age in the Aegean, rather than with the late Bronze Age period in which the Homeric poems were set. If the pottery was early Bronze Age and the gold was found with the pottery, then the gold was early Bronze Age too. And if the gold was early Bronze Age, then it was not Priam's treasure. It was someone else's treasure entirely, from a city that had burned 1,000 years before any event that could plausibly be called the Trojan War. Schliemann's response to these objections was not to engage with them directly, but to press forward with the publication of his results and the arrangement of the treasure's display, both of which occupied a large portion of his energy. In the years following the discovery, he eventually donated the treasure to the city of Berlin, where it was displayed at the Royal Museum of Ethnology, and the donation was accompanied by the kind of ceremony and public attention that Schliemann had learned to generate and manage with the same efficiency he had once applied to commodity trading. He was not, to his credit, entirely without self-awareness about the scholarly objections. There are passages in his correspondence from the mid-1870s that suggest he understood, at some level, that the pottery problem was real and that the identification of the treasure with Priam was more assertion than demonstration. But the public position never wavered. It was Priam's treasure. He had found it. The scholars who disagreed were applying the kind of pedantic caution that had led them to deny the existence of Troy in the first place, and their judgment on the identification was therefore suspect. The objects themselves, in their physical reality, had a quality that made the scholarly objections feel, to non-specialists, somewhat beside the point. The great diadem alone, with its hundreds of individual chain links worked in gold so fine that the technique required to produce it had not been rediscovered by the 19th century, was an object of such obvious and sustained craftsmanship that it argued, by its own existence, for a civilization of considerable sophistication and resources. Whatever city these things had belonged to, it had not been a simple one. The cups and the earrings and the silver vessels all told the same story. Here had been people who knew what beauty was, who had the skill and the materials and the social organization to produce it, and who had hidden their most precious things at the moment of the city's destruction, with the focused urgency of people who intended to come back for them, and who did not. That last detail, the intention to come back, is one of the things that makes the deposit affecting in a way that transcends the scholarly argument about which Troy it came from. Objects hidden in a crisis are objects that represent a bet on the future, a decision made under extreme pressure that the future would eventually arrive and that someone would be there to receive them. The person or people who gathered those diadems and cups and lance tips and placed them in the copper vessel and covered them in the burning city were not preserving them for posterity. They were preserving them for themselves, for the hour after the danger had passed, for the life they expected to resume when the immediate catastrophe was over. That the catastrophe wasn't temporary, that the life did not resume, that no one ever came back for the things in the copper vessel is not something the objects record. They record only the intention, the last optimistic act of people whose optimism turned out to be wrong. Schliemann understood the emotional force of this, and he wasn't wrong to understand it. Where he was wrong, in the view of the scholars who would spend the following decades working through the implications of what he had found, was in locating that emotional force in the wrong story. The people who hid the treasure were not the Trojans of Homer. They were earlier, older, from a city that preceded Homer's world by so many centuries that they would have been as foreign to Priam's court as Priam's court was to the Europe of 1873. But the feeling Schliemann attached to the objects, the sense of human presence in the gold, the sense of a hand that had touched these things and then never touched anything again, was not wrong. It was just misidentified. The hand was real. It was simply not the hand he thought it was. The debate about the identification played out in the European scholarly press across the mid-1870s and into the 1880s, with Schliemann defending his position in increasingly voluminous publications and his critics mounting objections that grew steadily more technically grounded as the new science of stratigraphy developed and provided them with better tools for the argument. Schliemann was not a passive defender. He returned to Hisarlik for additional seasons, refining his understanding of the site's stratigraphy, engaging with the criticisms in the scholarly literature, and gradually, without ever quite admitting it explicitly, adjusting his published descriptions of the layers in ways that suggested he was beginning to register the problems with his original identification. The adjustment was subtle and was never accompanied by a public retraction, because public retraction was not something Schliemann's psychology was well suited to, but it was there in the successive editions of his publications if you read them carefully, side by side, and noted where the language had shifted. The wider consequences of the discovery for the discipline of classical archaeology were considerable and are still unfolding. Before Hisarlik, the consensus view was that the Homeric poems, whatever their literary and cultural importance, were not historical documents in any meaningful sense, and that the world they described was irrecoverable, probably because it had never existed in the form the poems presented. After Hisarlik, that position became impossible to hold with the same confidence. Something had existed there, something ancient and complex and substantial, something that had been built and rebuilt and destroyed and built again across thousands of years, something that bore at least a family resemblance to the world the poems described, even if it was not identical with it. Schliemann had not found Homer's Troy. He had found something that made Homer's Troy plausible, which was perhaps the more significant achievement. The photographs of Sophia Schliemann wearing what her husband was calling the Jewels of Helen circulated across Europe and made Heinrich Schliemann the most famous man in archaeology. They also made him the most controversial, because the scholars who were paying close attention had already begun to notice something that Schliemann had either missed or chosen not to examine too closely. The treasure and the city it came from were far older than any date that could plausibly be associated with the Trojan War, and so the treasure passed into European hands, and the photographs passed into European memory, and the scholarly argument that had been building since the first critical responses to Schliemann's preliminary announcements continued to sharpen and accumulate, gaining technical precision with each new excavation season and each new voice that entered the conversation. We can move forward now, a decade or so, into the later excavations at Hisarlik, to the moment when someone with the right training and the right instruments finally stood in those same trenches and began to see what Schliemann had both found and missed. That someone arrived in the form of a young German architect, and what he saw there, layer by layer in the cut faces of the mound, was the clearest possible illustration of the difference between certainty and understanding. Wilhelm Dorpfeld was a young German architect and archaeologist who had been trained in the precise technical methods of classical archaeology at Athens, and he first came to Hisarlik in 1882, joining Schliemann's excavation team in a role that was nominally subordinate, but that quickly became, in practical terms, something considerably more significant. Dorpfeld stood in the trenches at Hisarlik and began to understand, layer by layer, what the stratigraphy of the site actually meant, and what the implications were for everything Schliemann had claimed. He was not a hostile presence, not a critic arriving with an agenda, but a careful technician whose gift was the ability to read the physical evidence of a site without imposing a predetermined conclusion on what he saw. And at Hisarlik, the physical evidence, read carefully and without predetermined conclusions, told a story that was considerably more complicated than the one Schliemann had published. Dorpfeld brought to the excavation the systematic approach to recording that Schliemann's earlier seasons had lacked. the careful documentation of the depth and position of each find, the precise recording of the relationships between layers, the use of architectural analysis to understand the phasing and sequence of construction at the site. He applied these methods to what remained of the undisturbed parts of the mound and to the stratigraphy visible in the existing trench walls. And what emerged from this analysis was a site chronology that was both richer and more damaging to Schliemann's published account than even the most skeptical of his critics had suspected. The number of distinct occupation levels at Hisarlik was larger than Schliemann had identified. Dorpfeld's analysis eventually distinguished at least 9 major phases of occupation, each representing a distinct city that had been built on the leveled remains of its predecessor, and the chronological span of these phases extended from the early Bronze Age, roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization, through to the late Roman period, a span of roughly 4,000 years during which the mound had been almost continuously inhabited by communities whose material culture and architectural traditions changed substantially from one phase to the next. The 9 cities were not simply early and late versions of the same community. They were, in some cases, separated by gaps of abandonment, by evidence of violent destruction, by complete changes in the pottery traditions that suggested not continuity, but replacement, one population giving way to another across the long centuries. The specific problem for Schliemann's identification was the position of Troy III, his burned city, within this chronological sequence. Dorpfeld's analysis placed Troy III firmly in the early Bronze Age, roughly contemporary with the period in Egypt that preceded the New Kingdom by several centuries, a period that the Homeric poems, whatever their historical basis, could not plausibly be describing. The Trojan War, if it was a historical event at all, belonged to the late Bronze Age, to the period around 1200 BCE or somewhat before, when the great palace cultures of Mycenae and Tiryns in mainland Greece were at their height, and the eastern Mediterranean was a world of interconnected kingdoms, trading in metals and grain and luxury goods across distances that still seem improbable. You map them on a modern atlas. Troy II predated that world by more than 1,000 years. The treasure Schliemann had found, the gold and silver objects that had made his name and Sophia's image famous across Europe, came from a city that had burned in the early Bronze Age and had nothing to do, so far as the evidence could show, with any event that could be called the Trojan War. Sit with that for a moment, because the full weight of it takes a moment to settle. Schliemann had spent the better part of 30 years working toward a single identification, had staked his reputation on it, had published it in multiple languages in multiple countries, had displayed the evidence for it in one of the great museums of Europe. And the identification was wrong. Not wrong in a minor technical sense, not wrong about a detail that could be revised without disturbing the main argument, but wrong about the fundamental claim. The treasure did not come from the Troy of the Trojan War, and the city it came from was not the city Homer was describing. The specific dimensions of the error are worth understanding, because they illuminate something important about the nature of the evidence and about what Schliemann was and was not capable of seeing when he looked at it. The pottery problem, the fundamental mismatch between the ceramic material associated with the treasure deposit and the late Bronze Age period that the Homeric poems described, was discoverable from the material Schliemann had already excavated. It required comparative knowledge of Bronze Age ceramic sequences in the Aegean that was still developing in the 1870s, but that was not entirely unavailable, and several scholars who had been following the excavation's publications had noticed it almost immediately. Schliemann's own records of what he found in the Troy II layer contained enough information for a trained ceramic specialist to identify the chronological problem. if anyone had been given the time and the access to examine the records systematically. The error was not, in other words, invisible. It was simply inconvenient, and Schliemann's method of dealing with inconvenient evidence was to move past it and keep digging. There is also the question of what Schliemann did or did not do with the stratigraphic evidence that his own trenches produced. The walls of those trenches, at the end of each season, contained a legible record of the site's occupation history in the changes of soil color, texture, and composition that marked the transitions between layers. A trained archaeologist standing in those trench walls and reading them carefully could have identified the approximate sequence of occupation phases and assigned rough chronological positions to each one on the basis of the associated ceramics and architectural remains. Schliemann could not do this himself because he didn't have the training, but he could have employed someone who could, and in the early seasons he chose not to. The choice was not negligence exactly, but it was a consequence of the same prior certainty that governed everything he did at the site. He already knew what the sequence meant, or believed he did, and detailed stratigraphic recording would have added complexity to a picture he preferred to keep simple. Dörpfeld continued excavating at Hisarlik after Schliemann's death, working with a methodological rigor that the earlier seasons had lacked, and the picture that emerged from his post-1890 work was both more precise and more sobering than Schliemann's public account had suggested. The 9 cities became clearer in their boundaries and their sequence. The chronology of the site was refined through increasingly sophisticated ceramic analysis, and the identification of Troy III as the Homeric city became progressively harder to defend with each new season of careful work. The layer that Dörpfeld identified as the most plausible candidate for the Homeric Troy was Troy VII, a settlement at a considerably higher level in the mound than the one Schliemann had focused on, a city of the Late Bronze Age that showed evidence of violent destruction at approximately the right chronological moment, and that had the spatial scale and the defensive architecture that the Homeric poems associated with a city worth besieging for 10 years. Troy VII was not intact. It had been disturbed by later construction, partly excavated by Schliemann's earlier trenches, as he drove toward the deeper levels, and stripped of much of the contextual material that would have allowed a full picture of its destruction to be assembled. But what remained of it was suggestive, and the suggestiveness was, in its way, more compelling than Schliemann's confident identification of a city that turned out to be the wrong one. Suggestive evidence that points in the right direction is more useful to scholarship than confident evidence that points in the wrong one. The identification of Troy VII as the most likely Homeric candidate has been broadly accepted by subsequent archaeology, though it has never been proven in any definitive sense, and the question of whether the destruction visible in that layer corresponds to an event that the Greek oral tradition preserved and eventually transmitted into the Homeric poems remains genuinely open. What can be said is that a substantial city of the Late Bronze Age existed at Hisarlik, that it was destroyed by fire and violence at approximately the right historical moment, that its defensive walls and internal organization were consistent with the kind of settlement the poems describe, and that its location on the northwestern Anatolian coast placed it at exactly the geographical intersection of Greek and Anatolian interests that the poems present as the context for the war. This is not proof. It is a convergence of evidence that makes the story more plausible than it was before Schliemann took his spade to the question, which is precisely what he claimed he would produce, and which is, in the end, rather more than his methods deserved to deliver. Schliemann's reaction to Dörpfeld's analysis was characteristically complicated. He did not, in public, concede that his identification of Troy II as the Homeric city was wrong. He could not. The public identification was too large a part of the story he had built, too central to the celebrity and the institutional relationships and the access to future excavation funding that his published account had generated, to be dismantled in a press release. What he did in the later seasons of excavation and in the revised editions of his publications was quietly adjust the framing of his claims, soften the certainty with which the identification was presented, introduce qualifying language that had not been present in the earlier publications, and give Dörfeld increasingly prominent acknowledgement in the accounts of the excavation's findings. This was not a retraction. It was a careful, gradual repositioning by a man who understood the commercial realities of scholarly reputation and was managing them accordingly. The tension between Schliemann's public position and his private understanding of the problems with that position is one of the more interesting aspects of his later years, and it is one that his biographers have found frustrating because the evidence for it is oblique and requires careful reading across a large body of correspondence and publication to assemble. There are letters from the mid-1880s in which he discusses the stratigraphic problems at Hisarlik with a frankness that his published work of the same period does not display. There are passages in his diary that suggest a man who was rethinking his conclusions more thoroughly than his public statements indicated. And there is the fact of his continued return to the site, season after season, which can be read either as the determination of a man who remained convinced of his original identification, or as the restlessness of someone who was looking for confirmation that was becoming harder to find. The later years of Schliemann's archaeological career also included work at other sites that, in retrospect, cast interesting light on the Hisarlik identification problem. His excavations at Mycenae, on the Greek mainland, in 1876, produced finds of extraordinary richness, including the royal shaft graves with their gold death masks and their abundance of Bronze Age metalwork, and Schliemann announced, with his characteristic certainty, that he had found the burial of Agamemnon, the Homeric king of Mycenae, who had led the Greek fleet to Troy. The pottery and architecture at Mycenae were late Bronze Age in character, the period that the Homeric poems were describing, and this made the Mycenaean finds, from a purely chronological standpoint, more consistent with the Homeric world than the material from Troy 3 at Hisarlik. The irony was not lost on the scholars who were following both excavations. Schliemann had found the right period at Mycenae and the wrong period at Troy, and the discovery that should have prompted a reconsideration of the Troy identification simply became another chapter in the expanding narrative of his success. Hisarlik continued to occupy him. He returned repeatedly through the 1880s, each season producing additional refinements to the site's stratigraphy under Dörfeld's careful guidance, each season deepening the technical picture of what was there without resolving the central question of which layer corresponded to the Homeric city. Schliemann's health was declining in these years. He suffered from a chronic ear infection that had troubled him for decades, and that was worsening, and the physical demands of fieldwork in the Trode were no longer as easy to absorb as they had been when he began. He died in Naples in December of 1890, of complications from the ear condition, on his way back to Hisarlik for what would have been another season of work. He died, that is to say, in transit between his winter home and his excavation site, which is in its way the most appropriate ending for a man who spent his entire life in motion towards something he never quite reached. He never stopped moving toward it, not once, not in 50 years of waiting and working and digging. What Dörfeld's post-1890 seasons also established with uncomfortable clarity was the full extent of what Schliemann's early method had destroyed: the spoil heaps that ringed the mound, the enormous quantities of material that had been dug out and dumped in the years between 1871 and the adoption of more careful recording procedures contained within them the mixed remains of at least 4 distinct occupation phases, including portions of Troy VII that could no longer be studied in their original positions or their original relationships to each other. Ceramic material from early Bronze Age levels had been dumped alongside pottery from the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Architectural fragments from one period lay mixed with those from another, and the spatial relationships that would have told a story about the organization and use of each settlement had been permanently erased. Archaeology moved forward, the methods improved, became more refined, became more sensitive to the subtleties of evidence that Schliemann's approach had been too blunt to register. But the material that had been removed from Hisarlik in those first seasons could not be put back, and the information it had contained could not be recovered from the spoil heaps where it had been deposited. By the time serious stratigraphic analysis was applied to Hisarlik, it was already too late to recover what had been lost. Troy VII, the layer that bore the clearest signs of violent destruction at roughly the right historical moment, was still present, still legible, still real, but the context that would have made it fully understandable had been removed by the very excavation that had found it. Schliemann had been right about the large thing. He had been wrong about almost everything else. And that's where we leave the excavation and its consequences. The spoil heaps and the stratigraphic losses and the slow, painful reckoning with what the method had cost. And we can move forward now to the present, or near to it, to the site, as it exists today, and to the question that the whole story has been building toward since Schliemann first picked up his penknife in the early morning light of that May morning in 1873. The archaeology of Hisarlik did not stop with Schliemann and Dortfeld. It continued through the 20th century and into the 21st, and what it produced is a picture of the site that is both richer and stranger than anything either of them imagined. The question of what Homer remembered and whether the poems are pointing at something real has not been resolved, but it has been substantially clarified. The site as it exists today has a quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has not stood there and impossible to capture in any photograph or plan. A quality that has to do with the relationship between the visible evidence and the knowledge of what lies beneath and around it. The excavated layers are visible in section, one city cut through by another, cut through by another. The different strata distinguishable by color and texture in the exposed walls of the great trench that Schliemann drove through the mound's center and that remains, a century and a half later, the most dramatic feature of the site. From certain angles, standing at the edge of this trench and looking down, you can see 4,000 years of human habitation compressed into a depth of roughly 15 meters of soil, each layer representing a city that was once the entirety of someone's world. The place where they were born and worked and died. The place they defended and the place they lost. The plain beyond the mound stretches to the sea, and the sea is visible from the top of the mound on a clear day, the Aegean lying flat and blue-grey in the distance, with a narrow channel of the Dardanelles cutting across the view to the northeast. The hills behind the site are low and dry in summer, covered in scrub and wild thyme, and the wind that moves across the plain in the afternoons carries the smell of the sea mixed with dust and dried grass. It is a place that feels, against all rational expectation, like somewhere things happened, and the feeling is not merely the product of knowing the story. It is something in the physical relationship of the site to its landscape, the way the mound commands the plain, the way the plain commands the approach from the sea, the way the whole setting makes an instinctive sense as a place worth fighting over, a place where whoever controlled the high ground controlled the access to everything on either side of it. The archaeology of the 20th century added considerably to what Dortfeld had established. A major new excavation program began in the 1930s under the American archaeologist Carl Blegen, who brought to the site the stratigraphic methods and ceramic analysis techniques that had been developed in the decades since Schliemann's time, and whose work produced a substantially more refined picture of the site's occupation history. Blegen confirmed and elaborated Dorpfeld's identification of Troy VII as the most plausible Homeric candidate, pointing to a subsection of that layer, Troy VII, which showed particularly clear evidence of violent destruction in a dense urban context, with storage jars buried in house floors suggesting a community that was preparing for a siege or had recently survived one, and with skeletal remi, ends and weapon points scattered through the destruction debris in ways that implied sudden violent catastrophe rather than gradual abandonment. The evidence from Troy VII is suggestive without being conclusive, which is a phrase that archaeologists apply to a great deal of the evidence from this period and this part of the world, because the nature of the surviving material does not generally permit the kind of certainty that would satisfy a legal standard of proof. What can be said about Troy VII is that it was a substantial settlement of the late Bronze Age, probably inhabited by a population of several thousand people, with defensive walls of considerable scale, internal organization, suggesting an urban community with craft specialization and storage facilities appropriate to a trading center, and a destruction layer dated to roughly 1200 BCE or somewhat before, placing it at the moment of the widespread Bronze Age collapse that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean and brought down the Mycenaean palace cultures, the Hittite Empire, and the Egyptian New Kingdom simultaneously. The storage jars that Blegen found embedded in the floors of Troy Tyvint's houses are among the more affecting pieces of evidence from the site, because they are so specifically a record of human intention rather than human action. Pithos jars, large ceramic storage vessels of the kind used across the Bronze Age Aegean for holding grain and oil and dried goods, do not bury themselves in house floors. They were placed there deliberately by people who were preparing for the possibility of a siege, stocking the ground floor of their house against the likelihood that they might be unable to leave it for an extended period. The decision to bury jars in a floor is a decision made in anticipation of a specific kind of danger, and the danger it anticipates is the danger of encirclement. Whether the siege that those jars were stored against was the one the poems remember, we cannot say. But the jars were stored. The people who stored them were expecting something, and a destruction layer that sealed those jars into the floors tells us that whatever they were expecting arrived. That collapse is important context for understanding the Homeric story, because the world the Iliad describes, a world of interconnected Bronze Age kingdoms trading in bronze and luxury goods and fighting for control of the sea routes that made that trade possible, was a world that was ending at precisely the moment the poems placed the Trojan War. The war itself, in the Homeric account, is the product of a world in which great kingdoms could mobilize large fleets and sustain multi-year campaigns in distant territories. A world that required the administrative infrastructure and agricultural surplus that only the palace economies of the late Bronze Age could generate. After 1200 BCE, that world was gone, and the kinds of warfare the poems describe became impossible for several centuries, until the archaic Greek city-states rebuilt the social and economic complexity that would make them possible again. Rest here with that for a moment, because it has implications for how we understand the poems themselves. If the Trojan War happened at all, it happened at the end of the Bronze Age, in a world that the Greeks of Homer's own time had almost entirely lost contact with. The poems were composed in the form we have them in the 8th or 7th century BCE, which means they were composed somewhere between 400 and 500 years after the events they purport to describe, in a society that had forgotten almost everything about the Bronze Age except the residue of stories that had survived the collapse through the oral tradition. The poets who shaped the Iliad and Odyssey into the form that reached us were not remembering the Bronze Age. They were imagining it on the basis of accumulated stories that had passed through a centuries-long game of transmission during which enormous quantities of historical detail had been lost and replaced with the material of subsequent ages. What is remarkable, and what the archaeology of Hisarlik and Mycenae and the wider Aegean Bronze Age has made progressively clearer, is how much the poems got right despite this process. The catalogue of ships in the second book of the Iliad, a long and seemingly tedious list of the Greek contingents and their home cities, has been shown to correspond surprisingly closely to the pattern of Mycenaean settlement in Greece, as revealed by archaeology. The cities listed as major Mycenaean centers in the poem are, in many cases, the sites that archaeological excavation has confirmed as major centers of the late Bronze Age, while cities that were prominent in Homer's own time but that had not yet been significant in the Bronze Age tend to be absent or minor in the catalogue. This is the kind of detail that a poet inventing freely from the material of his own time would not have got right, because the information required to get it right did not exist in the 8th century BCE in any form that a poet could have accessed. It survived only in the oral tradition, embedded in the accumulated stories of the preceding centuries, preserved without anyone knowing it was being preserved. The geography of the Trojan plain corresponds reasonably well to the actual geography of the Troad. The social organization of the Homeric world, with its gift exchange economy and its palace-based kingdoms and its elaborate protocol of aristocratic warfare, is broadly consistent with what the Linear B tablets from Mycenae and Pylos tell us about the actual social organization of the late Bronze Age Aegean. The material culture described in the poems, the bronze weapons, the great shields, the specific types of cups and vessels that appear in the feasting scenes, matches in various ways the material culture of the late Bronze Age rather than the Iron Age in which the poems were composed, suggesting that the tradition had preserved fragments of genuine Bronze Age memory alongside the much larger body of later material. There is also, and this is one of the more remarkable developments in the study of the Bronze Age Aegean over the past century, textual evidence that places a city of northwestern Anatolia at the center of diplomatic and military conflict in the late Bronze Age. The Hittite archives, deciphered in the early 20th century from clay tablets found at the Hittite capital, contain references to a place called Wilusa and to a city called Tarawisa, names that appear to correspond through well-understood patterns of linguistic change to the Greek name Ilios and the name Troy, the two names by which Homer's city is known in the Iliad. These references place Wilusa at the western edge of the Hittite sphere of influence, in a region of Anatolia that corresponds geographically to the Troad, and describe it as a place of sufficient importance that it was the subject of formal treaties between the Hittites and the powers of Western Anatolia. We do not know, and we may never know, whether the Wilusa of the Hittite archives is the same site as Hisarlik. But the possibility that it is has become difficult to dismiss. This is not to say that the Iliad is a historical document, because it clearly is not, and the scholars who have tried to read it as one have generally found themselves in the same position as Schliemann, right about the general direction, wrong about the specific claims. What it suggests instead is something that is in some ways more interesting, that the oral tradition that produced the Homeric poems was capable of preserving, over centuries of transmission and transformation, a core of genuine historical memory so embedded in the narrative structure of the stories that it survived even when the specific details had been lost or altered. The poems remembered, in some general way, that there had been a time when great kingdoms existed in the Aegean, that those kingdoms had fought each other across long distances at enormous cost, that one of the great contests of that era had centered on a city in the northwest of Anatolia. The details were wrong, or partly wrong, or impossible to verify. But the general shape was right. Schliemann understood this, or something like it, though he couldn't have articulated it in these terms because the archaeology of the Bronze Age that would have given him the vocabulary did not yet exist. What he understood, at the level of intuition, if not of argument, was that the poems were not simply literature in the modern sense, not simply the product of a poet's imagination working freely on invented material, but something more complicated, a kind of encoded memory, a narrative that had its roots in events that had actually occurred and places that had actually existed, even if the encoding process had introduced distortions that made the original events irrecoverable from the text alone. This was the insight that led him to Hisarlik, and it was correct. What was wrong was everything he did with it once he got there. The lasting contribution of Schliemann to the study of the ancient world is not the specific discoveries he made, though those were significant, and not the specific identifications he proposed, since most of those were wrong. It is the demonstration, accomplished through the brute force of his particular obsession, that the boundary between myth and history is not a clean line, but a permeable membrane, that the stories a culture tells about its past contain, embedded within them, traces of a reality that more sober and more methodical approaches had concluded was irrecoverable. He proved this not because he was right about Troy, but because he was right about Hisarlik. There was something there. It was very old, and the poems had been pointing at it for more than 2,000 years. The scholars who told him he was wrong were wrong about the large thing, and he was wrong about almost everything else. And between those two categories of wrongness, the actual past lies somewhere, still partially recoverable, still partially hidden, still more complicated than anyone's certainty about it. What Homer preserved, if he preserved anything, was not a record and not a lie, but something older and stranger than either. The residue of an event so large that it outlasted the civilization that produced it, traveling forward through centuries of oral tradition until it reached a poet who shaped it into the form that reached us. Schliemann was not wrong to believe the poems were pointing at something real. He was wrong to think he could find it by digging straight down. And that's where the question rests, in that space between what the evidence permits us to say and what we would like to be able to say, between the poems and the plain, between the story and the ground. We have come a long way from the parsonage at Ankershagen, from the boy at the table and the engraving of the burning walls, and the time has come to let the narrative slow, to move away from the argument and back toward the place itself, the low mound in the flat ground at the edge of the Aegean, which was where this story began, and which is where it properly ends. The light is changing. The afternoon is giving way to evening. Let us go back there. The mound is still there, low against the sky at the edge of the plain, the excavated layers visible in the cuts that Schliemann and those who came after him made in its sides, the exposed strata reading like a cross-section of time itself, one city pressed down into another, pressed down into another, each one the ruins of someone's entire world. The plain beyond it runs to the sea, and the sea is still the color Homer called it, and the wind still comes in off the water, the way it has always come in, carrying nothing with it now but salt and the smell of grass. There are tourists here in the warm months, people who come to stand on the mound and look out at the plain and the strait, and think about what happened here, or what might have happened here, which is a slightly different thing. They come because of a poem, most of them, or because of a story that descends from a poem. The shape of it familiar even to people who have never read the original, because certain stories are so thoroughly embedded in a culture's sense of itself that they circulate without attribution, recognizable to everyone and owned by no one. The wooden horse. The face that launched 1,000 ships. The wars of Troy. These phrases have been traveling for 3,000 years. They show no particular signs of stopping. Schliemann did not create the story, but he changed what it meant to believe it. Before him, believing that Troy was real was a position that required you to argue against the accumulated weight of scholarly consensus, to make a case that trained classicists found at best naive and at worst faintly absurd. After him, believing that Troy was real was simply the position that the evidence supported, qualified in various ways, complicated by the stratigraphic problems his method had created, but fundamentally correct in the way that the boy at the table in Ankershagen had always believed it to be correct. The scholars came around. It took time, and it required the more careful work of Dorfeld and Blechen and those who followed them to provide the technical grounding that Schliemann's own publications could not supply, but they came around. Troy was real. It had always been real. The debate moved on to the question of which layer and what happened there, which is a more precise argument and in some ways a more permanently unresolvable one. The treasure is no longer in Berlin, but before we follow it to where it ended up, it is worth staying a moment longer with the question of what Schliemann's work changed, not just in archaeology, but in the broader relationship between educated people and the stories of the ancient world. The second half of the 19th century was a period of considerable anxiety about the historical foundations of the Western literary tradition. The classical education that had shaped European intellectual life for centuries rested in part on a relationship with the ancient world that was essentially literary, a relationship built through close reading of texts in which the distinction between historical and legendary material was often unclear and frequently irrelevant to the pedagogical purpose. Scholars read Homer and Virgil and Thucydides as exercises in language and rhetoric and moral instruction, and whether Troy had existed as a physical place or whether the Trojan War had occurred as a historical event were questions that most practitioners of classical education did not press too hard, because pressing them risked destabilizing a tradition that depended on treating these texts as authoritative even when their authority was of a specifically literary rather than historical kind. Schliemann pressed the question hard, and the answer he got was unexpected in ways that neither he nor his critics had fully anticipated. The result was not a simple confirmation or a simple refutation of the literary tradition, but something more complicated, a demonstration that the relationship between the ancient texts and the ancient world was real and tangible, that the poems were not simply floating in a literary space above the physical world, but were connected to it by roots that went deep into the soil of specific places and the debris of specific events, even if the nature of that connection was more complicated and more uncertain than either the literary tradition or its critics had assumed. This changed something in how educated people related to the ancient world. It introduced a new possibility into the relationship between text and place, the possibility of verification, of going to a specific location and looking for the physical residue of a story, of testing the claim that a poem was pointing at something real rather than something imagined. Schliemann made this kind of verification seem possible, even when his specific attempts at it turned out to be methodologically flawed, and the possibility he opened has not closed since. Archaeologists working on the Bronze Age Aegean today are still in a sense, working within the framework that Schliemann established when he stood on the mound at Hisarlik and asked whether the poems and the ground might be talking about the same thing. The plain in the afternoon holds heat in the summer, the limestone ground reflecting it back upward, so that the air above the excavation site shimmers slightly in the late hours of the day, and the scrub vegetation that covers the unexcavated portions of the mound gives off a dry, herby smell of thyme and dust that hangs in the air long after the wind has carried it some distance from the source. Lizards move across the exposed stone of the ancient walls, negotiating the same surfaces that were laid by Bronze Age hands 3,000 years ago, indifferent to the question of which city these walls belonged to or what happened when they fell. The walls are warm in the afternoon. They have been warm in the afternoon for a long time. It left Berlin in 1945 in the chaos of the war's end, taken by Soviet forces as part of the vast movement of cultural property that accompanied the defeat of Germany, and it eventually came to rest in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, where it has been since the 1990s, when its presence there was officially acknowledged. It sits behind glass in a Moscow museum. These objects from a Bronze Age city in northwestern Turkey, named for a Trojan king they had nothing to do with by a German businessman who found them in 1873 and interpreted them through a framework that turned out to be wrong. The cups and the diadems and the earrings have outlasted the framework. They have outlasted Schliemann and Sophia and the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire and the Soviet Union. They are still there, still gold, still the work of hands we know nothing about, in a city with no particular connection to any of them. There is a version of Schliemann's story that is simply a cautionary tale about the dangers of confirmation bias, about what happens when a person is so certain of their conclusion before they begin their investigation that they cannot see evidence that contradicts it. This version is true as far as it goes, and it is the version that is most frequently told in introductory courses on archaeological method, where Schliemann serves as a convenient example of what the development of stratigraphic technique was designed to prevent. It is not wrong to tell his story this way, but it is incomplete. The more complete version requires acknowledging that the same quality of conviction that made Schliemann a methodologically inadequate archaeologist was the quality that made the excavation at Hisarlik possible at all. No trained archaeologist of the 1860s or 1870s would have mounted the campaign at Hisarlik on the grounds that a Bronze Age city of the kind described in the Iliad was likely to be found there, because the trained archaeologists of that period were trained in a tradition that had already concluded that the Homeric world was legendary and therefore not excavatable. The scholarly consensus was wrong about this, but it was wrong in a way that was internally consistent with the methods and assumptions of the discipline, and overcoming it required exactly the kind of motivated irrationality that Schliemann brought to the question. He was wrong about almost everything and right about the one thing that mattered, and the one thing that mattered was sufficient to generate a century and a half of productive work that would not otherwise have begun. This is not a comfortable conclusion for a field that places high value on methodological rigor, which is perhaps why the cautionary version of the Schliemann story has tended to dominate over the more complicated one. The complicated version requires holding two things simultaneously: the recognition that his methods caused irreversible damage to the site and to the historical understanding it contained, and the recognition that without his methods, in all their blundering certainty, there would have been no site to damage in this particular way. What was lost at Hisarlik is real and significant. What was found there is also real and significant. The two facts exist in permanent tension with each other, and the tension is not resolvable which is perhaps appropriate for a site whose central question has also refused to resolve for 3,000 years. Sophia Schliemann outlived her husband by 42 years. She spent some of that time defending his reputation against the growing body of scholarly criticism, some of it raising their 3 children, some of it in the Athens house that Schliemann had built for them, and that still stands in the city centre. She never returned to Hisarlik after his death. Whether she missed the work, the early mornings and the trenches, and the particular quality of attention that excavation demands is not something the record tells us. The diadem photographs exist. She is wearing the gold in them, looking directly at the camera, composed and unreadable in the way that people are when they are not quite sure whether to be proud or uncertain of the thing they are participating in. The photographs have aged in interesting ways. In 1873, they were read as evidence. Here is the woman wearing the jewels of Troy. Here is the gold that proves the story. Now they are read differently, as documents of a particular moment in the history of scholarship and of self-presentation, a moment when a man with a very large conviction and a very small penknife found something extraordinary in the ground and immediately began constructing the narrative that would ensure the world understood it the way he wanted it to be understood. The gold in the photographs is not Priam's gold. The story in the photographs is not the story of Troy in the way Schliemann believed it was. But the photographs are real, and Sophia is real, and the gold is real, and the intensity of Schliemann's belief, visible in everything about how those images were staged and distributed, is also real. Something happened in that trench in May of 1873. The objects that came out of that trench had been buried for roughly 4,000 years before Schliemann's penknife found them, and they had survived the burning of their city and the slow accumulation of the centuries above them, with a patience and a stillness that nothing human can quite match. The argument about what it means has not ended, and it will not end soon. The current state of knowledge about Hisarlik is, in many ways, a testament to everything that Schliemann got wrong, and everything that the scholars who followed him got right. The site has been excavated almost continuously since the 1870s, with each generation of archaeologists bringing more refined methods and more comprehensive understanding to the task. And the picture that has emerged is one of extraordinary complexity. A site occupied across 4 millennia by communities whose languages, pottery traditions, architectural practices, and social organization changed substantially from one occupation phase to the next. The 9 cities of Hisarlik are not a sequence of iterations of the same community, but a sequence of distinct episodes of human presence in this particular piece of ground, each episode shaped by its own circumstances and connected to its predecessors only by the accident of geography, by the mound that previous occupation had created and that new settlers found convenient to build on. What this complexity means for the Homeric question is that the question was always more complicated than Schliemann's confident announcements suggested, and more interesting than the scholarly skepticism of his contemporaries implied. The poems were not either straightforwardly historical or straightforwardly mythological. They were something in between. Something for which the literary and historical vocabulary of the 19th century did not have adequate terms. A genre of narrative that preserved genuine historical memory in a form so transformed by centuries of oral transmission and literary elaboration that the memory and the elaboration could no longer be reliably distinguished from each other. The poems were neither history nor fiction, but something older than either, a different relationship between story and event that required a different kind of reading. Schliemann could not read them that way because the conceptual tools required to do so did not yet exist, and the archaeological evidence that would eventually provide those tools was still underground when he began his excavations. He read the poems as a man of his era read them, as encoded history that could be decoded by the right kind of determined attention, and the determination he brought to the decoding was of a quality that the scholarship of his period could not match, even when it was right about everything else. He was wrong about almost everything except the most important thing, and the most important thing, it turns out, was enough. The plain in the evening takes on a quality that the afternoon does not have, a stillness that isn't simply the absence of wind, but something more like the presence of time, the accumulated weight of everything that has happened in this particular piece of ground settling back into the soil as the light fails. The hills darken, the sea disappears into the haze. The mound sits where it has always sat, somewhere in the layers below the tourist path, in the stratum that corresponds to roughly 1200 BCE, there are walls. There is a burn layer. There are the broken remains of Pethos jars and the scattered bones of people who did not leave. Whether those people were the Trojans of Homer, whether the destruction that ended their city was the one the poems remember, whether the war that produced the greatest literary monument in the Western tradition was fought in this plain, or somewhere nearby, or not at all, we don't know. We may never know. The evidence does not resolve. It accumulates and points in a direction, and then stops short of certainty. Schliemann would have found this intolerable. The partial answer, the pointing without arriving, the evidence that converges on a possibility without producing a proof. These were not the things his particular kind of certainty was equipped to inhabit. He needed to be right in the full sense, to have found the actual city, to have held the actual gold of the actual Priam in his hands. He got something different. He got the right place and the wrong layer, the right question and the wrong answer. A discovery that proved what he believed and disproved what he claimed. It is not the vindication he wanted. It may be, in the end, the more interesting kind. The question of how to remember Heinrich Schliemann is one that his successors in the field of Bronze Age archaeology have found persistently uncomfortable. He was not, by the standards of scholarship, a reliable narrator of his own work, and the gap between what he claimed to have found and what he had actually found was large and consequential in ways that caused real damage to the historical understanding of the site. He manipulated evidence, suppressed inconvenient details, attributed discoveries to convenient moments in order to produce a more coherent narrative than the messy reality warranted. The story of finding the treasure with Sophia on the morning of the workman's break, for instance, is almost certainly a reconstruction after the fact. The evidence suggests that the discovery was made over a period of days rather than in a single dramatic morning, and that the shawl and the penknife and the hushed domesticity of the account are literary embellishments on an event that was concised, rather less cinematically convenient in its actual occurrence. None of this cancels the achievement. The mound is still there. The 9 cities are still there. What is left of them, legible in the exposed strata of the excavation walls and in the databases of ceramic analysis that have accumulated over a century and a half of subsequent work. The question that Schliemann asked, the question he took from a boy's encounter with an engraving in a history book and carried forward for 50 years, was the right question to ask. It was answered partially, imperfectly, in the way that questions about the very distant past tend to be answered, with enough evidence to establish that something happened and not quite enough to say exactly what. The mound in the dusk, the plain going dark, the wind off the sea, steady and cool and indifferent. The walls burned, They burned a long time ago, in a city whose name we think we know and whose story we think we remember. And what is left of that burning is the dark stratum in the cut face of the earth, the carbon and ash of a night that was someone's whole world ending. The night ended, the world went on. The story survived. It survived because the poems held it, and the poems survived because they were beautiful enough to be memorized and repeated across generations that had no other way to transmit what they knew. And what they knew was not the historical facts, which they had lost, but the shape of the story, which they had not. A city. A war. A decade of siege, walls that burned. This much, despite everything, held. The shape is still recognizable after 3,000 years of transmission and transformation and scholarly argument and the careful accumulating work of new excavation. The mound is still there. The plain still runs to the sea. It is still recognizable because it is, at some level, true. The gold is in a museum, most of it in Moscow now, taken from Berlin at the end of the war that followed the war that Schliemann spent his life trying to find evidence of. The diadems, the cups, the lance tips, the earrings that Sophia wore in the photograph on the morning of the discovery. All of it is there, behind glass, in a building in a city that has nothing to do with any of it, which is perhaps the appropriate end for objects that were never in the right place to begin with. Schliemann believed they belonged to Priam. They are older than Priam by 1,000 years. They were made by people whose names we don't know, in a city whose name we don't know, for purposes that the objects themselves have stopped explaining. They have outlasted everyone who ever understood what they were for. The mound remains. The wind comes in off the water. The plain is quiet in the early evening, the way it was quiet when Schliemann first stood on the hill and decided he already knew what was under it. He was not entirely wrong. He was not entirely right. The layers are still there, what is left of them. Each one a city. Each city a life that someone lived completely, somewhere in that compressed darkness. In the stratum that corresponds roughly to the right century, there are burned walls. There is evidence of destruction. Whether that destruction was the one the poems remember, we cannot say with certainty. We may never be able to say. But the walls burned. That much is real. Thank you for spending this evening on the plains of Troy, in the company of a man who was wrong about almost everything and right about the one thing that mattered. If this is the kind of company you like to keep at night, subscribing to the channel means the next story will be waiting whenever you are ready. There is always another obsession, another excavation, another question that turns out to have an answer more complicated than anyone expected. Sleep well.